She was, I would say, the first to try to take this phenomenological method that was beginning in, the turn of the 20th century and try to fuse that with scholasticism. She's one of the people who, like Aquinas, fused these traditions that didn't seem like they were compatible. She's trying to do that because truth is bigger than a tradition.
Welcome to Purposeful Lab, a Maggia Center podcast. I'm Catherine Hadra with my co-host, Dr. Daniel Keebler. And in today's episode, we're continuing and wrapping up our analysis of art and the transcendence of art, and also introducing the topic of suffering.
Right. Yeah. So we have the crossroads here.
Yes.
We get both of them in with today's guest.
Yes. And we're doing that really through the lens of learning about Edith Stein, who then became Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. So we'll be hearing about her perspective, the perspective of the saint, but of a modern day female saint too. So she has this unique perspective that's still very much relevant to today.
Yeah. She's a very interesting historical figure. She's also an interesting figure in the church, and she's also a very interesting figure and pivotal figure in modern philosophy. So,
as an intellectual,
very impressive.
I know, and our guest is impressive as well. She'll be guiding us through this conversation on Edith Stein. Genevieve Buono is a Kansas City native. She's a doctoral student currently at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., in the School of Philosophy. She graduated from the University of Dallas with a BA in English and a concentration in Spanish. And her research interests include philosophy of education and the human person. She's currently writing her dissertation on Edith Stein. It's obvious she knows a lot about her. I know we learned a lot as well. So I think with that, here's our conversation with Genevieve Buono. Genevieve, thank you so much for being here. It's a joy to meet you. Can you just first start us off by telling us about yourself and your work today?
It's great to be here with you. Thank you. So I'm originally from Kansas City. I went to undergrad in Dallas, Texas, University of Dallas. And then since then, I've been working on a PhD in philosophy at the Catholic University of America. And currently, I live in Front Royal, Virginia with my husband. We were married in June. I was teaching for the last year and a half in D.C., and now I'm focusing on writing my dissertation on Edith Stein's aesthetics.
So you were at Dallas as an English major, and now you've transitioned into doing your PhD in philosophy. What drew you into philosophy, and particularly Edith Stein?
I grew up playing a lot of music with my siblings, and we were really fortunate to live in this city where there's really excellent arts and really excellent teachers, but not insane competition. So we actually got to be surrounded by really wonderful artists, and we have a bunch of artists in our family. So I think I went into college with this, without much of an idea of what philosophy was, oddly enough, even though my uncle was a philosophy professor. And then I ended up experiencing in my first philosophy course as a freshman, which was required, I ended up noticing, these are actually the questions that I have. But I came to those questions through art, and he's talking about them in philosophy, he being Plato in this case. So I ended up choosing an English major, but then by the time that college was finishing, I was realizing, okay, I have way more questions, and they seem to be more philosophical. I really want to get down to the meat of what does justice mean, or things like that. So that's how I ended up applying to CUA's philosophy program. And then once again, just completely immersing myself in philosophy. Coming in as an English major, I had kind of some catch up to do, and I was just so happy to be learning. And I came to Edith Stein because it was kind of providential. Somebody gave me a book about her. It was by Alistair MacIntyre, which is just a really nice introduction. And the more that I started thinking about her, I knew that she was at this place in the philosophical tradition that CUA has a specialty in. And so some of the teachers that I admired most worked in phenomenology, which is her field. And she's a Catholic. But I hadn't heard her name come up in philosophy courses at all. So my question became, well, why? Is it because her writings actually aren't that philosophical? I know she's also a saint. And it was just that curiosity that got me to read a bunch of her stuff. And then once I read it, I was very much drawn to her personality and to the way that she talks about things with a much more personal view.
Yeah.
And what is it exactly that you're doing your dissertation on when it comes to Edith Stein?
I am working on her aesthetic philosophy, or her philosophy of art. So she doesn't actually have a dedicated book on philosophy of art, but she has a lot of very insightful comments scattered throughout all of her works, I would say. So my dissertation is just trying to collect those and present them as a whole so that Edith Stein's aesthetics can actually be talked about as a thing, make it a little bit easier.
Well, it'd be good to unpack sort of that, talk a little bit about Edith Stein, her life, and what influenced her, and then get into your dissertation topic. And we've had a phenomenologist on before, Dr. John Crosby on previous seasons, but I'm sure a lot of our listeners might not be familiar with that, so we can get into phenomenology as well. But maybe we should start just with Edith Stein's life.
And I've always been intrigued by Edith Stein, and I've always wanted to learn more about her, but personally, I've been kind of daunted by her work. She's brilliant, and this philosopher, which is not my background. So just to get us started as we're digging more into Edith Stein, can you tell us about her early life?
So she was born in what was at the time a Prussian area, but it's still part of Germany. It's one of those areas in the world that the borders have changed a lot. But she was born to this big family. She was the youngest child, and her mother was a very devout Jew. So she's in this Jewish family. Her father died when she was very young, and her older siblings helped to raise her to a large extent. But they were not terribly faithful in their Judaism. They were a little bit more skeptical of the religion. But the culture and her mother's piety were very, very strong formative influences on her. So she was in this historically Jewish area in Germany, and she considered herself both completely German and completely Jewish. So she wrote a book called Life in a Jewish Family later on, as obviously the rise of Hitler and anti-Semitism was growing in Germany. She was really talking about, okay, what does it mean to be a Jew and a German? And she said, well, to my mother, it would be absolutely unthinkable that she wasn't German. That couldn't have been a question. So her mother ran a lumber yard and supported the whole family. And she was respected as this very, very solid, impressive businesswoman. So I think when you talk about early influences, that strong sense of German culture, love of German culture, big Jewish family with a very pious mother, and very, very strong mother figure, super important to her.
Later on in our conversation, I'd like to talk more about her writings on women, but it sounds like that was very influential as well.
I would say so, yes. And a lot of sisters as well, who are each, when you read her letters, and her Life in a Jewish Family is sort of an autobiography. It's very, very strong characters with really strong intellectual lives.
So what led her to her conversion then, coming from that Jewish family?
Right. So even though her mother was pious, by the time that Edith was 15 years old, she kind of went away from home for a little bit to help her sister, and she decided that she was agnostic. So at 15. Yeah. So it was very much a reflective choice. She was extremely precocious from a very young age, and was always thinking about these things. So it wasn't like a rebellious choice to become agnostic. It was much more, I just don't think I can, this is not what I believe. Then she went to university, and she loves a bunch of different disciplines. So her route into philosophy was actually through encountering Husserl's work, Edmund Husserl, who's a very important phenomenologist. She kept on bumping up against his name in her psychological studies. And after that, she decided to switch to philosophy. And that's where she started meeting Christians who were devout Christians and also philosophers. So that unification of faith and reason, she started to have a personal interaction with it. And that was the beginning. So then there were a couple other experiences that she had, especially during the war. One of her friends died, and his wife carried that grief in such a beautiful way. And she was also a Christian. And that really struck Edith as being like a lived example of what it means to actually, live with the cross.
That's a powerful reminder to the power of a witness and how it influenced. Yeah. Very much.
So then her actual conversion is, she is a little bit reticent about it. She says it's her mystery.
Okay.
All that we know is that she eventually got to the point where, for whatever reason, she picked up Teresa of Avila's autobiography, read it in a single night, said, "This is the truth," and then the next day went and bought a missal and the catechism and studied the Catholic faith to the extent that when she went to Mass for the first time and asked the priest to enter the church, he said, "Well, you need to do a course." And she said, "Hey, just examine me. Like, we'll see." She knew everything already.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've always heard her conversion described as she converted through philosophy. That was really the route that brought her to God. Would you agree with that characterization, although there were obviously multiple events?
Yes. So she said later on, and JP too also said, that, she loved God as truth long before she realized it. So she has this famous quote that I love that says, "Anybody who loves the truth or who seeks the truth is seeking God, whether he knows it or not." And that definitely, I would say, characterizes her, from a young age, really having a strong love of truth and seeking that. And that's what brings her into the faith eventually.
And then, again, thank you for sharing that, because there's so much about her life I didn't know. And I know it was after her conversion to Catholicism, she eventually took on a religious name in the Carmelite order. Can you speak about that part of her journey, when that came about and the name that she took?
Sure. So when she was baptized in the church, her baptismal name was Teresa. So she had actually already chosen that then. And that was for Teresa of Avila. So Stein had a really strong love of the Carmelites as well, and the Carmelite tradition, and Teresa of Avila as being kind of the mother of that tradition. So then when she discerned into the Carmelites, that happened about 11 years after her conversion to Catholicism. And in that time, she had actually been living for most of it, like 8 years, in a Dominican convent, teaching girls, but living essentially as a nun, even though not with vows. Then she discerned into the Carmelite monastery, and she chose Teresa Benedict of the Cross, which means Teresa blessed by the cross. She wrote a book about the cross. I think that the whole blessed by the cross idea comes from both the Carmelite tradition, St. John of the Cross, all of the things that have been written, and then also Stein's own reflectiveness on suffering, the nature of suffering, and how that is really part of a Christian life.
So when during this time was she, in the story of her life, was she most writing her sort of philosophical works? Was this before, after her conversion? Was it?
Right. So both.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Her doctorate was on, or her dissertation was on empathy, which we use that word now in kind of a colloquial way to sort of mean compassion. She's using it in a technical philosophical sense, but essentially what she's doing is talking about how is it that I can know something about what another person is experiencing? What are the conditions for making that possible? So that's her first philosophical phenomenological work that is not religious in character. Then she wrote a couple other things, including one on the state and one on communities. So you see like this very much political awareness that she has. She volunteered as a nurse in the Red Cross during World War I because she felt so strongly that she needed to help her country. So those early works on interpersonal relationships and community and the state are kind of the phenomenological works that aren't terribly influenced by her faith. Then you get a couple of shorter works that are, one is on freedom and grace, and then she converts, and then she writes these two really, really big, beefy works on metaphysics, where she's trying to fuse the phenomenological tradition with the earlier scholastic tradition. And those works are clearly penetrated by the Catholic faith.
Okay.
So you can see that in her writings.
I'm struck by, again, she took the name Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, blessed by the cross. She wrote on empathy. She obviously was thinking and knew about suffering. And what was her greatest cross during this time of her professional and religious life?
I suppose as she's growing in the philosophical world. She is quite talented, very precocious, as we said. So she ended up working as an assistant for Edmund Husserl. Martin Heidegger later worked also as an assistant for Husserl. So it's really interesting. If you think about the historical place in which Stein was living, it's this small circle of philosophers who are all really interested in getting back to the real things. That's what they say. And then they all go in massively different directions. So the contrast is really clear. Like, Stein dies in the concentration camps. Heidegger is a member of the Nazi Party.
Wow.
Their philosophy itself also ends up taking a lot of different directions. So I would think one of the crosses that she was bearing at that time actually had to do with the career options available to her. Despite her talent, she was not able to pursue a professional career, first because she was a woman. So both Husserl and Heidegger refused to support her and recommend her in these positions because it just wasn't done at the time. She was one of the first women in Germany to get her PhD. A second cross that she was bearing is her family's feelings about her conversion. So she kind of held off for a while on telling her mother that she had joined the Catholic Church because she knew what a heavy burden that would be for her mother to bear. And I think that was something that she kind of carried with her to the end. They talk about her superiors in her order talk about how every single week she would write a letter to her mother, and she was really worried about preserving that relationship despite how much she was, physically separated from her family and also religiously separated at that point.
Yeah. And speaking of crosses, the end of her life was marked by being in a concentration camp. And so what led to that? And yeah.
So obviously her ethnicity is Jewish, even though her religion became Catholicism. At a certain point, she was kind of a public figure. She was traveling around Germany and Europe teaching and giving speeches about women. And then she was advised, you need to kind of calm down on that for a little bit, lay low. Political situation is getting kind of tenuous. And before long, the order decided to transfer her and her sister, all non-Aryan members of the religious order, to Holland because of the, rise of the Third Reich. So she was there for about 3 years. Then the Dutch bishops publicly criticized the Nazis for their treatment of the Jews. And a couple weeks later, the Nazis retaliated by rounding up all non-Aryan Catholic members. And so that's why she was deported. And a few weeks later, she was killed in Auschwitz.
You mentioned her sister. So what was her relationship with this specific sister at the time?
So actually, one of her sisters was also a Carmelite nun.
Wow.
And they both were taken on the same day. They both died.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
I'm struck by, again, this whole season we're talking about human flourishing and what that looks like and the different forms that can take. And speaking of Edith Stein, her life ended in tragedy. But does she still model to us human flourishing?
I would say definitely so. It's pretty striking, both if you read her letters and her autobiography, but also if you read comments from her students. She was this very, very warm person. Like, her nieces and nephews loved her. They loved when she came because she was always making things fun, and she was very, very caring. She was very calm as well. Her students were struck by her thoughtfulness. So if we're measuring human flourishing by the extent to which there's almost this magnetic draw to a person as being a very positive influence on whoever's around them, she definitely embodied that. I think another aspect of human flourishing that she manifests quite clearly is her ability to receive suffering and articulate it in a way that is very peaceful and kind of interconnected with the other aspects of life. So, human flourishing is not just about survival. And she definitely, her whole life shows that.
So we've talked about how Edith Stein, she's a canonized saint of the church, and so she has this personal sanctity. But she's also, a excellent philosopher, and she's in this school of phenomenology. So maybe you can explain sort of what that is and how she's situated in that school. We talked about Husserl and her work with him, and how what is a phenomenologist, and then how is hers sort of unique.
Mm-hmm. Good question. So phenomenology is really a long term for something that's actually much more simple than it sounds. I'm going to explain it by putting it in contrast to what came before it, what it's reacting against. So modern philosophy, we can talk about like Kant's philosophy, had a very, very strong focus on our minds as being kind of not machines, but very, very powerful structures that impose laws on things. So essentially, anything that we are thinking about as meaningful is because of this particular structure of our minds. Then we've got, in addition to that modern philosophy, we've got the beginning of modern psychology that begins articulating any kind of experience as a psychological phenomenon. Phenomenology says, okay, it's not just about our minds. Actually, our minds are able to look at something other than themselves and see it for what it is. So the tagline of phenomenology is back to the things themselves. That's why I say it's simple. It's kind of just going back to a normal way of thinking about things where you're not focused on the kind of machinery, for lack of a better word, of your own mind, but instead you're able to just talk about, okay, I'm seeing this table. It has this feature. I'm seeing joy. Edith Stein talks a lot about joy. Okay, what is joy? Well, we can talk about what joy is by examining different experiences where we have some kind of intuition, some reception of joy. And then by looking at a number of those different experiences, we're going to get a better understanding of what that thing is that's not coming from my own mind.
So when you said Edith Stein and her, philosopher friends and her social circles always talked about getting back to the real thing.
Mm-hmm.
It was the philosophy.
Yes.
Okay.
And so her student circle around Husserl, the Husserl circle, they were very much drawn to Husserl because he seemed to have this, and he did have this very strong focus on back to the things themselves. Let's talk about the thing that we are experiencing, the thing that we are intuiting, not our minds that are doing that. Obviously, we're also going to talk about our minds. The students later on started to disagree about whether or not he was staying in that realist world or if he was starting to move toward idealism. So that's where you see this split in the early phenomenologists. They go off in very different directions. Mm-hmm. So you've got JP2 and Ratzinger, along with von Hildebrand. They developed these ideas in a more personalist direction. Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, they started working on these ideas and they developed them in a much more existentialist direction. So this tradition ended up kind of being the very fertile ground for a lot of different ideas to come out of it.
And you're talking about the realist idea that our mind is not creating the reality, and that we're looking at real things, but at the same time we have a mind that's unique. So you're seeing things slightly different, but it's the thing is there that we're sharing that phenomena. Yes. Is that sort of what they're getting at?
Yes. So I suppose one way of saying it is clearly it's given to us. It's obvious that our minds receive things in a certain way. If I film something on camera, the camera is going to pick up that image differently than if I look at that image that I saw in my memory, because my mind is different than a camera. But there's still something that you're looking at. Yeah. So it's both our minds and the thing.
How would you summarize Edith Stein's greatest contribution to this specific field of philosophy?
Well, she was, I would say, the first one to try to take this phenomenological method that was beginning in, the turn of the 20th century and try to fuse that with scholasticism. And her Potency and Act and Finite and Eternal Being are her two like big, thick books. Those are where she really tries to put those two traditions in dialogue with each other, which is a tremendous task. And that's part of the reason that she's so daunting, is because she's working with these two traditions that are very, very developed and have their own specific vocabulary.
Yeah.
So that's, I would say, Alistair MacIntyre says she's one of the people who, like Aquinas, fused these traditions that didn't seem like they were compatible. She's doing that. She's trying to do that because truth is bigger than a tradition.
I know we're going to delve more into your specific dissertation and what Edith Stein had to say about art and aesthetics, but I did want to hear your thoughts and hear more about Edith Stein's work when it came to women and her essays on women. Can you tell us about her contributions there?
Yes. So maybe some background would be she considered herself and called herself a feminist. She was really behind the women's suffrage movement when she was young at the university. And like I said, she was speaking publicly. A lot of her public speaking role was involved in speaking about women.
Mm-hmm.
And she was teaching girls. So I think as this person who was raised by women, pretty much sisters and her mother, and teaches women, lives with women, it's kind of a natural subject area for her. Something that is, I would say, profound in her work is that she's describing women and man as equal but not the same. So she's really focused on what does it mean to be a woman as a woman? What is actually unique and very special about that?
Mm-hmm.
And when she writes, it kind of, the first time that I read her book, Essays on Women, it's like, I don't know what I think about this. And then I went back up a couple of years later and read it again. And I think what's very striking is that first she establishes, okay, here's the essence of woman. And it involves, being a mother, being a bride. But obviously that's lived out in very, very, very different ways. So she'll say, here are some very feminine vocations. But a woman as such, because each woman is different and has individual characteristics as well as feminine characteristics, there is no job that a woman can't do. So you have to be very careful. I think her philosophy of woman is very complex. For instance, one of the most controversial things she says is that women and men are different species, which you would go, whoa, what's she saying there? So she doesn't mean, okay, they're actually different species. She is saying there's something, there's a positive meaning to what it is to be a woman and a positive meaning to what it is to be a man. And then also there's all these other individual characteristics.
Yeah. Did she see sort of essential differences between like men and women in terms of how they would live that out, like and live out their flourishing? Like, is that something that she focuses on in her writing?
Yes. So I want to preface this by saying there's nothing in what she says about human flourishing as a woman that would contradict human flourishing as being a universal thing that applies to women and men. It's more just kind of getting into the particulars of that. Woman as such is more concrete, is something that she says. Like, you're going to be more attached to physical reality because a lot of what it is to be a woman and a lot of like what's special about being a woman is actually like the woman is the one who carries the child. That's a much stronger connection to your body. So you're going to be much more embodied in everyday life. That's going to look different from woman to woman. That doesn't mean that there can't be a woman who's like an abstract mathematician.
Yeah.
But you want to think about that as a woman.
Fascinating. At this season, we've had already a few episodes talking about the transcendence of art.
Mm-hmm.
And you are, you again, your dissertation is on Edith Stein and art.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit more about what Edith Stein had said and what you can share about your dissertation.
Sure. So I would divide Stein's philosophy of art into two main categories. The first one is when she's talking about the human creative process. So she's following this Christian tradition where when we speak about creation properly, we're talking about creation ex nihilo. So creating something out of nothing. Human acts of creation are never that. We're always receiving something. We're working on something that already exists. So that really sets the context for understanding artistic creation, is understanding that you're working on not just already like matter that already exists. You're not creating the clay, but you're also actually working with ideas and meaningfulness that you've received because you've been living. So there can be a tendency to overemphasize the human creative spirit, kind of having this, we're little gods, just creating our own worlds that we live in.
Mm-hmm.
So when she talks about the human creative process, she's, I would say, giving great dignity to the human creative spirit, but also providing a helpful corrective to that idea that we have unlimited creativity. So that's one side of her work on aesthetics. The other side is when she's talking about what the work of art itself is, and specifically how there's truth in art. So she has this contrast between historical truth and artistic truth. Okay, historical truth, she talks about Napoleon. If a historian is working on Napoleon, their job is to accurately capture the concrete details of what his life was and how he was. If an artist is drawing a picture of Napoleon, his job is to characterize something that is not quite as concrete. He could maybe fudge a couple of the details. Like maybe Napoleon's hair wasn't exactly this color. Maybe he wasn't exactly this size. But the job of the artist is trying to accurately capture the essence of Napoleon. So once you have that difference between capturing the essence of something and capturing the concrete particular details of something, then we're starting to talk about, okay, what is meaningfulness itself? What's this essence thing that we're talking about? If it's not an empirical detail that I can measure, then what is it? So art provides this way of a much more, I would say, embodied way, because we're talking about an actual portrait, of getting to that extremely abstract realm of meaning in itself, the essence of things. And that's where I think her interest in art comes from, and that's why it's very powerful, is because by talking about how does a work of art mean something, you're actually talking about what is meaning in general.
Yeah. And that's something like art being this uniquely human thing, right? And this, in both of those, the creativeness and the meaningness, they sort of go together. And that the meaning, for example, in the art is something that, is the artist putting that in there, or is that something that we're extracting from that? You know, the sort of the deconstructionist, whatever meaning you get out of it, and that's sort of part of the creative process, right? And so, how does Edith Stein look at art like as a human activity? It's like, why do we do art, and what is the role of the artist there? Yeah,
it's a great question. That's where I think Stein has a really helpful framework to provide that answers these questions, and where her phenomenological training really comes in handy.
Okay.
Because again, we've got that issue of, okay, is the meaning something that I am putting into it? You know, an artist can paint a portrait. They have some sort of meaning that they see in it. But then somebody goes to the gallery and sees that portrait. Maybe they get a totally different meaning out of it. Okay. Is that just all there is to it? Or is an experience, and that's what meaning is? Or is there something that we're all responding to in common that the artist put into that? Did they come up with it? I'm basically rephrasing your question. Her way of approaching that is to do a both and. So like I said, it's not subjective or objective. That's a false dichotomy. There's something in the middle. So what she would say is that there actually is meaningfulness. Like, we don't just read Homer's Iliad over and over again because we each get something else out of it, and that's kind of fun.
Okay.
You know, there's something clearly more powerful going on. And we can talk for a long time about what he means by justice, because we see that he's actually saying something about justice, and there actually might be something that justice is. So that's the kind of objective meaning. And she goes into a very complex explanation of what meaning is and how it exists. And that is her metaphysical stuff, her big theory. The other side of it is also, she affirms that, of course, we each receive meaning differently. Why? Because if you ask a toddler what a circle is, they're going to be able to point to a circle, and then 5 years later, they're going to have a better explanation of what a circle is. So, of course, we're each learning about meaning in a different way. So it's because she's able to talk about what the human person is and how our minds receive meaning, and also what meaning is in itself, that she's able to actually explain, okay, what is artistic meaning? And how is it that it's actually both something objective and something that we receive differently and experience differently. And there's not really a contrast between those.
Would Edith Stein's aesthetic philosophy, would it have anything to say, or can you apply it to something that is culturally relevant today or ethically relevant today?
Yes, I would say so. I think the most powerful aspect of philosophy comes down to that very simple principle that humans can't create ex nihilo. So we're not ever creating something out of nothing. There are various forms of constructionism that are kind of culturally embedded right now. So this idea that we build the realities around us. I live in my own world, and I want to make sure that I am sustaining that world in a way that feels good to me. Or our political society has a self-sustaining structure that is either hurtful or helpful, but that's all that there is to it. Basically, we live in the world that we create. That basic principle that Stein has of, no, we actually are not creating this out of nothing. There's something underneath whatever this creative experimentation is that we're doing. That corrects that idea of constructivism. So we could also put that in a much more personal context. She uses the word self-creation in a very limited sense. So it's kind of obvious that to a certain extent, we are responsible for shaping ourselves. You are responsible for creating habits. Whether or not you want to intentionally create habits, you're still creating habits. And so that's a form of self-formation, or you could even say self-creation. But again, you're not creating that out of nothing. There's an underlying essence to who you are that's not just human in general, and not just woman or man in general, but also very specifically individual, that you have been given. So that's actually not yours to create. You get to shape that in different ways, but there's an underlying nature to things. So I think that's probably the most direct.
Yeah, that seems to focus on when you're talking about women, but this is a little broader, focus on the individual person, the uniqueness of the individual person and how they interact with the world and with each other to create, in quotes, themselves and how they're going to interact, but they're limited in sort of who they are. Right?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great point. And something that I haven't mentioned much is that Stein has a huge focus on human individuality as such. And I think a lot of that comes out of her experience as a teacher. And anybody who's taught, or I mean, you guys interviewing different people, clearly everybody that you're talking to has something individual about them. You're not going to teach every single student the same. You're not going to interview every single person the same. So that's just kind of a clearly given fact that each person has an individual nature. So where do you go with that? What does that mean? How do you actually make sense of that without suggesting that we're all completely different with nothing in common? She does a really good job of articulating the reality of human individuality within this context that still provides like an objective moral framework, essentially.
So you've talked about Edith Stein, how she holds that, that we don't create ex nihilo, right? We're not creating out of nothing. We're creating, when an artist creates, there's something that they've been given, and then they create, But how does then she view like creative genius, like a scientific genius, comes up with a new theory, comes up with novelty, or just a artistic genius that does something totally different, like a Shakespeare that you can't. How did that come to be? If it's not out of nothing, right? Where does that inspiration sort of come from then?
Right. So one way of answering that is I didn't actually know this, but the etymology of the word invent actually has more to do with discovering. So it's not creating something out of nothing, but it's a matter of uncovering something that already exists. So when we're talking about creative genius and what it means to be creating some new work of art that's really meaningful, some new artistic way of thinking about them, some new scientific discovery. Stein would say, yes, that's a genuinely new contribution because you're uncovering something in a different way, not because you're creating that thing. So it actually, that's why I say she dignifies human creativity by placing it in its proper space, which is, no, you're not creating the meaning of X, Y, Z, but you are showing that in a really new and powerful way. So you're helping us recognize something that we can now see better for what it is, but maybe we had encountered in different ways before. So kind of underlying that whole framework for her is this understanding that, okay, meaning itself exists, truth itself exists, but it's beyond our ability to completely own. So we can always get closer and closer and closer to it. We can always grasp it partially, but we're not going to be kind of proving a certain thing, then moving on. We can prove parts of things, but we're not going to own it completely.
As we're starting to wind down this conversation, and thank you for all that you brought to light about Edith Stein's work, anything that you want to leave our viewers with about Edith Stein's philosophy or how it applies to all of us today?
Something that I find most inspiring about Stein's philosophy is that she is such a good listener to the philosophical tradition. So she's not just learning from her teachers, but she's also learning from her predecessors. And she speaks about that with great humility. Like, she describes herself in the introduction to two of her greatest works. She says, I'm writing this as a student for other students. So I think taking that approach to philosophy is listening and learning from much greater minds than ourselves. That's something that I've been trying to learn from her, because you can never really, you're never going to completely grasp the truth. Nobody can completely own it, but we can keep on pursuing it, and we're going to get better at that by drawing on the wisdom of all these people who came before us.
There's so much humility there. Again, you said she was one of the first German women to receive her doctorate, and yet she's just perpetually sees herself as this student who's learning. Can you just kind of give us an update about or preview when you'll be finished with your dissertation?
My husband and I are expecting our first baby in June.
Oh, congratulations.
I'm really excited about. Thank you. I'm going to try and write the dissertation in a year or two, and I'm kind of not setting a hard deadline because I don't know exactly what that'll look like to write with a baby.
No,
but,
exactly.
Yes, the goal is to finish within the next year or two, get the PhD, and then I love teaching, and I would love to continue teaching however I can.
Well, thanks for teaching both of us.
Oh, yeah.
I know for myself, I learned a lot, and congratulations to you and your husband as you live out this call to motherhood that Edith Stein talks about. Genevieve, thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you.
Well, as I mentioned to Genevieve, I've always been intrigued by Edith Stein. I've read some of her writings, but have been intimidated by her because she is this intellectual giant. So I know I really appreciated learning more about her. A quote that stood out to me that Genevieve said, a quote from Edith Stein, is, anyone who seeks the truth seeks God, whether or not he is aware of it. That's profound. I think that is reflected in her own journey, her own intellectual journey.
Yeah, and I think that's something like that's a theme of our of the podcast. You know, it's like the truth in science and philosophy and theology and psychology is going to eventually lead you to the source of that truth. And it's that we shouldn't be afraid of like searching for the truth, because as that quote, that's leading us to God.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're doing here, asking these big questions, you know, not afraid of seeking the truth and what that entails. What stood out to you? Did you learn anything about Edith Stein in particular?
I think at the end she was talking about sort of how Edith Stein saw the uniqueness of each individual person, and that there's something about Catherine and the way that you're going to see the world that's going to be different than the way even though the world is real and it exists, we both process it, and so we're creating the best version of ourselves, hopefully. But the best version of me is going to be a little different than the best version of you, and this uniqueness that each person has as we shape ourselves, not out of nothing, right? That we have this sort of, I've been given myself as a gift, and now how do I shape myself to be the best person that I can be? I think that's something that, you see how everybody reacts differently to different situations. She's talking about how unique her students are. They respond to different things. You see, if I look at my kids, they're all unique. They respond quite differently, and that was a given to them. That was how do they shape themselves to be the best version?
And again, equal in dignity, man and woman, equal in dignity, but different.
Right.
Different gifts. Episode's not over yet, because now we go to the office hour segment. And there are two questions I have for you. As I was looking through the latest science news, as one does, there was this report that a plan to genetically engineer a woolly mammoth has taken a giant step forward. Colossal Biosciences, this company, has reprogrammed cells from an Asian elephant, aiming to create a mammoth hybrid, supposedly, that looks exactly like its extinct counterpart. And the modified cells can help the hybrid mammoth grow a woolly coat, and along with other traits that are necessary to survive the Arctic. What do you make of this development? And is this a good idea to bring back an extinct species?
Yeah. First of all, I don't know if this is a good idea or not, right? But let's just sort of look at what they're doing and where they're at, because it's science fiction starting to become real, right? So they've been able to take cells from elephants and turn them back into basically pluripotent cells that they can maybe turn into sperm and eggs, right? So the idea is that they could then modify them to put in genes that were there in the woolly mammoth, and then create a modified elephant that's got sort of woolly mammoth traits, right? So they haven't done this yet. They haven't made the sperm and the egg. They don't even know exactly what genes to modify, but they've sequenced, they have some DNA sequence of woolly mammoths, so they sort of know what genes they might want to do. But then, so it's a long way from some fruition, and then how they're going to have to put them back into a uterus somewhere, probably then into an elephant. And then the question is this something we should be doing with the endangered species, the elephants and so forth. So, and then, the idea that we don't know the effects of putting woolly mammoths back into the environment. First of all, we're a long way from it's very Jurassic Park, and it always ends bad in those movies of Jurassic Park. Everybody dies, and it's usually not a good thing. So, but that's where that. It's still a long way from getting to a live woolly mammoth, right? But again, there's a lot of sort of ethical issues that they've got to sort through there.
Okay, I'll keep on reading the latest science news to see how this progresses. Okay, my second question, this is something I was wondering. We've obviously talked about how faith and science are compatible, and how the Catholic Church in particular has been on the forefront of science throughout time. But is there, from, just your opinion, is there an area of science, of research, that you wish the Catholic Church would invest more time and resources into?
Yeah. I think, the church has always been supportive of science, throughout the millennia. But in terms of fields and modern fields, like I would think of fields that the church could do more in, or support more, that had moral and ethical implications, right, and can benefit society that way. And one of them is to develop new sort of cell lines. So we've heard about the use of like cell lines derived from fetal tissue, right? And so the ethical issues with that. But given the sort of our ability to modify, to make stem cells and to modify cells, there's a lot of ability to make new tester cell lines in ways that are totally ethical. And so trying to figure out how to make new cells so we don't have to rely on these fetal cell lines. We have the technology and the tools now to make cell lines in an ethical way relatively quickly, and that's something I think, the church could support, or Catholic universities, research universities could support.
Yeah, well, hopefully that, will be the case in the coming years. I hope so.
Yeah.
All right, Dan, thank you again for a great conversation. Again, really enjoyed today's episode. And I hope you did as well. Make sure to go to majacenter.com for all the latest on Purposeful Lab. And, of course, to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. We'll see you again for next week's episode.